So what's cap and trade? It's in the name of everything we just discussed. And please indulge my lapse into the background there. It is a means to raise the price of energy. That is not a side effect that they're working on. Maybe they'll fix. It's the point. It is not a side effect. It is the point. Cap and trade imposes a rationing scheme under which the state decides how much of something the private sector can use. Electricity from disfavored sources, gasoline, just like World War II style rationing. And then it imposes ration coupons. But now they do it on people who don't vote, corporations. It turns out, however, those guys were invited in to write the bill, and you weren't. So this ration or cap is set on the basis of historic emission levels. So if, for example, you have succeeded and grown, you are penalized and must buy ration coupons from someone who has failed and shrunk. One of many, many perverse incentives in this scheme. However, many members are rushing forth to claim, well, I've got this, that, or the other offset scheme or free ration coupons to utilities to make sure that the cost really doesn't trickle down to you. Look, to the extent any of those claims are true, offset schemes, all you're doing is admitting that you are undermining the express reason for the scheme to reduce emissions. Offset schemes mean, as in Europe, you won't actually reduce emissions. You will transfer wealth for someone to plant trees and take 80 years of projected tree growth in one accounting year and other such scams. You will pay China to stop doing something they just increased doing for the purpose of selling certificates, as even the International Herald Tribune has exposed, and so on. It's axiomatic. These are not just temporary to get political support. If it's going to work, that is, reduce emissions, it won't ever control climate, which is inherently not stable, by the way, anyway. It has to hurt. And so every member rushing forth for cover to vote for this, to say, I've got something to make sure it won't hurt, is saying, don't worry, it won't really work. I'm posturing. This is a gesture. It's an expensive gesture. Some of the claims are simply unsupportable. Free ration coupons to the utilities with the best lobbying offices in Washington. True story. That's how the bill turned out. But Europe proved that even if you give the ration coupons away to the utilities, they're going to perform the fairly logical calculation as follows. Well, I could have sold them, so I have an opportunity cost, and it is a cost to the company if I just burn them down by producing electricity, so I build the cost of selling them into your rates. That's what happened in Europe. One country, 1 year alone, Germany, $5 billion in increased electricity rates, no emission reductions, and what we call windfall profits, which doesn't mean a profit made by an oil company. A windfall profit dropped into the lap of the utilities who, there like here, designed the scheme. It didn't reduce emissions, and they had a very good argument. Well, I could have sold them. So, think of it this way. Whoever meets my Redskins in the Super Bowl this year will have scalpers selling tickets, whether they found them on the street, were given them by the state, or bought them. Precisely the same dynamic. It's axiomatic. It is the point. If this is going to reduce emissions, it has to hurt. It is not a side effect. This is the CEO of a German utility that helped design their scheme. He's an advisor to Angela Merkel. Like we have rent-seeking companies advising our president. Al Gore's investment partner has been put on a board with the CEO of GE, which retooled its businesses after they bought some of Enron's windmills and so on. And they're now advising the president, yes, we think these schemes we've been lobbying for before you were elected are very, very good ideas. That's my independent advice. Okay, well, we have German's version here saying higher electricity prices are the intent of the whole exercise. If you didn't have that, what's the point? Quoted in the Washington Post, April 2 years ago. Now, here's some insight on cap and trade from two EPA Region 9 lawyers. The regions track our judicial circuits, so you could call that the Ninth Circuit. These are San Francisco EPA career lawyers, people who want this, who want carbon rationing. They wrote a paper. Unlike a fee or a tax, a cap requires Soviet-style pre-planning. For example, if you wanted to reduce smoking, would you tax it or provide Soviet-style manufacturing quotas to the producers? Obviously, you would tax it. But taxes threaten jobs, the jobs of members of Congress who vote for them. So you impose Soviet-style production quotas. Quote, credits can easily be subject to gaming and manipulation, creating artificial scarcity that is likely to result in disruptions, electricity and gasoline, disruptions and unfairness. EPA career Region 9 lawyers. 4 things wrong with that statement, but they're telling you. A preview of such disruptions was provided by the market manipulations that created the California energy crisis early in this decade. We are slow learners. English to English translation. Rolling blackouts, gas station lines could become a reality. a legislated hurricane, in essence. This type of problem occurred in a Los Angeles cap-and-trade program called Reclaim, which failed spectacularly. It spurred a current federal fraud case, too. This invites fraud and gaming. You heard that Enron was behind this. I'll add some meat to those bones in a moment. So it's axiomatic. As a candidate, when among friends in the San Francisco Chronicle editorial board, candidate Obama said, somebody under my scheme, if somebody wants to build a coal-fired power plant, they can. It's just that it will bankrupt them because they're going to be charged a huge. Go ahead and burn coal. I'm going to bankrupt you, but go ahead. Just like with nuclear. Go ahead and smash your atoms. You just can't reclaim your spent material or store it, but go ahead and feel free to try. When I was asked earlier about the issue of coal, under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. He got it right. It was candor. Necessarily. Why? The point is to price electricity use far beyond current levels of usage. 80% reduction is where we're going. How expensive does that have to be? Well, you will cut other things out of your budget in order to keep the AC on, in order to maintain your automobility. The price is going to be very high. For cap-and-trade to work, it must hurt. If it does not hurt, it will not reduce emissions. Regardless, it is climatically meaningless. It is textbook all pain, no gain. It is a gesture. The question is how expensive or painful or ruinous a gesture will political vanity require or you allow. It's a tax. It's just the best kind of tax, a hidden tax. U.S. Congressional Budget Office, which used to be headed by the gentleman who's now the president's budget director, serially has said, this is a tax. It flies, swims, quacks, and does everything odious like a tax. It's a tax. I'll give you an English-to-English translation of this. It says, energy and consumer prices rise, output, employment, and real wages fall. The impacts are just the same. But there's a catch. This transfers wealth from individuals to special interests. You'll notice the president, at least intellectually honestly, proposed the government receiving all of the revenue from selling the ration coupons, 100% auctioning, as he called it. Okay, it was the way to pay for the health care plan. It was the way to pay for various things. Several people have gotten this wrong. They say, well, $646 billion over 10 years. No, the footnote actually said that's just how much of the plunder will be used for two discrete programs. It was actually to be the largest tax increase in the history of our country, over $300 billion a year. It was to pay for all of the engineering. It's a very expensive tax because of these social costs involved in the gaming and other problems and the tricks you have to play to hide the tax. It is, according to William Pizer of the center-left think tank Resources for the Future, 4 to 5 times as expensive as just taxing it. But you see, you don't get caught having voted for a tax, so you can obviously understand the appeal. How big a tax? Don't bother getting into this number game. I told you about the 646 versus 300, and then they trotted out some guy from MIT to say, well, it's really not that much. The numbers game is designed to distract. All of these are projections of the future and therefore of limited utility. The bill left major questions, the Waxman-Markey bill. Many things were not decided until the very end to avoid opposition from organizing. We still don't know what qualifies as one of these offsets and so on. And the MIT author they have trotted out is not, I suggest, shooting straight. When he said, well, the $3,100 per household cost isn't right because I really only believe it will cost $800. He made a mistake and upped it to $800. That's the deadweight loss per household. That's the loss to GDP per household. The $3,100 cost per household is because we took the amount of money they said they want to take and we divided it over the number of households. So unless you think the president's not being honest, that's the valid figure. They expect that much money. Now it's coming from somewhere and we can't always expect it to come from our neighbor, not us. So avoid the trap. All of these schemes are climatically meaningless. All we're discussing is how much money do you think we'll waste? There's only one assessment that matters, the president's. The objective is to cause your energy prices to necessarily skyrocket. All you need to know. If they want to distract with the numbers game, you say, I don't know what necessarily skyrocket means, and I don't want to find out. I understand that's the point. So, and bankrupt coal along the way, which is our energy security. We have centuries of it, which is why it's the target. So, but what if Democrats convince you it's a tax? Because Move On said last month, it's June now, so 5 weeks ago, if Republicans convince voters that clean energy legislation, they're talking about this, amounts to a new tax, Obama's plan is toast. Well, Start the toaster up. Nobody in this country realizes that cap and trade is a tax, and a great big one. That's not a Republican. That's the House's longest-serving member, Democrat John Dingell from Detroit, former chairman of this committee. And, of course, Senator Ben Cardin from Maryland, not a Republican, said cap and trade rationing is, quote, the most significant revenue-generating proposal of our time. You see, we don't have tax increases anymore. We have revenue-generating proposals, and this is the largest one of our time. So, inconvenient truths of cap and trade. The scheme is chosen solely to avoid voting for a tax, a direct tax. But this is inarguably a tax. Just ask the president's budget director. It's a tax. Quacks, swims, walks, everything else like a tax. But it's more expensive. The Congressional Budget Group, pressure groups, etc., Congressional Budget Office, pressure groups, and so on, admit it's a hidden but more expensive tax. Even EPA lawyers in the paper says it requires Soviet-style planning and is subject to widespread abuse via fraud and gaming. It's a wealth transfer to well-heeled lobbyists, special interests. So, of course, you should not be surprised to learn, as you were told, Enron invented carbon cap and trade for a reason. It was classic Enron. It was a way to make money, essentially picking your pockets with the government sanction for doing nothing. How do I know? I was innocently practicing law 12 years ago. Last month, when a little energy company out of Houston named Enron asked me to be director of federal government relations. Law firm said, of course, great idea, took the job. First day on the job, walked into a meeting with the Natural Resources Defense Council, backed out, excuse me. Next day, sat in for Kenny Boy at a meeting of something called the World Business Council they change the name occasionally, but it's a bunch of rent-seeking industries. It's the world's second oldest profession of trying to make your fortune off of governmental policy favors instead of innovation and competition and other, nasty things. French economist Frederick Bastiat wrote about rent seekers 300 years ago when he had this petition from the candle makers to the state to block out the sun for unfairly competing with their products. And he said, just like our windmill makers and others are saying now, imagine how we could be the leader in candle and candle-related technologies if only you could block out the sun. Now, there are actually unseen costs here, and that is taking it to its logical extreme, but Enron was pushing this. Enron very quietly cobbled together the world's largest windmill company, second largest solar panel company, world's second largest gas pipeline network out of Gazprom, set up a trading floor with Goldman to play bookies, wetting their beak at both ends, selling these ration coupons. And then they set about to add value to their investment. Now, this was 1997 when I quit. I sent an email, Houston, we have a problem. I was in this meeting with the Union of Concerned Scientists and other very measured groups, and BP, American Gas Association, Niagara Mohawk, and others. And I asked one of these gentlemen next to me, what are we doing sitting around a table with people who want to put us out of business? And he laughed and said they want to put coal out of business first. So this is what you call a Baptist and bootleggers coalition. People who otherwise do not see eye to eye, but have a shared interest in promoting prohibition. These folks were promoting energy rationing, in essence, to make a fortune off of it and to pursue an ideological agenda, and both viewing each other as useful idiots and with the idea of throwing the other under the bus at some given time. I know who would win this, by the way. But anyway, this is the since-released Enron memo. Nothing I'm telling you memo-wise I got, and I was not a lawyer with Enron, came from that. This was released later. Robert Novak wrote about these memos. Kyoto is exactly what we've been lobbying for. It will be good for Enron stock. 2 exclamation marks. Obviously needed at least 3. This is the What I Did in Kyoto memo from Ken Lay's Kyoto staffer. He actually had one. If implemented, this agreement, the cap and trade and so on, will do more to promote Enron's business than any other regulatory initiative outside of restructuring of the energy sector. Enron now has excellent credentials with many green interests, including Greenpeace, WWF, NRDC, and so on. This position should be increasingly cultivated and capitalized upon, in parentheses and misspelled, but you get the point, monetized. Enron invented the global warming industry. When Enron departed, others picked at their carcass and are now very vocal on the issue, BPGE and others. This is where this came from, and this is why you hear claims like, well, some of America's biggest companies support this. How bad can it be? Very bad. Just because they support it and are in a Baptist and Bootleggers coalition does not mean it is virtuous. And by the way, it will not reduce emissions. If that is really the point, you have a problem. Now, in closing, I want you to remember, this is another financial scandal in the making. It's also a political scandal for the very same reasons. Who would have guessed that a bill written by big business special interests will benefit big business special interests? Love big business, but not everything they suggest must be done. EU traders for years. I worked with several European think tanks essentially commuting to Brussels and some member states for several years on their experiment. It did not work. And traders have been calling it our new playground. Just Google that term. You'll see. EU traders were calling their cap-and-trade scheme our new playground. I'll tell you why in a minute. In one March week, various Wall Street derivatives types climbing out from the rubble looking for other fun claimed, I smell bucks to be made. I can see Nirvana coming. This will be a huge playground. Now, those aggressively pushing this scheme actually share a mindset. The U.S. firms deepest into pushing cap and trade were the first ones to lead the collapse. Lehman Brothers were the banker to Al Gore's group, among others, his cap and trade group. Merrill, very heavily invested in this and so on. The utilities pushing it share a very unhappy legal history of prosecution for market manipulation. This was a red flag with Enron. It was not an aberration. It was illustrative of the mindset, let's make money doing nothing. We create markets in state-imposed scarcity, trading pieces of paper. Now, even the non-financially vested left agrees this is a replay of the subprime mortgage mess. The market, this is The Guardian out of Manchester, the market must be unashamedly rigged. It leaves the state like medieval pardoners handing out unlimited indulgences. Europe's whiz-bang carpet market is turning subprime. The Guardian. It would create a system that poses almost identical challenges as those in the mortgage lending industry. Friends of the Earth. This spring. A left-leaning think tank, NDN, Robert Shapiro, quoted in the Houston Chronicle in April, cap and trade would create trillions of dollars in new asset-based financial instruments. Wall Street sees emissions permit trading as a lucrative new market that could earn them billions in inefficiencies put on your economy. Billions in new fees, commissions, and, while it lasts, speculative gains. Yes, we've seen this play before. No, they're not producing anything. These are inefficiencies larded onto the economy. Simply because, as Bastiat also wrote, you can pay a kid to run around town smashing windows. Think of all the economic activity that would be created. That is not economic growth. They're not productive economic activity. You're paying a bunch of Wall Street derivative types to run around smashing windows. That does not mean that an earthquake or a hurricane is good for the economy. That's what we're talking about here. So the reality of cap and trade in Europe, it did not reduce emissions. Read between the lines when you're told it did. That's nonsense, and I'll show you in a second. However, it still led to leakage. For example, steel jobs are now in Carroll County, Kentucky. Alabama, they're looking at building a plant in Louisiana, but now that they see how silly we're being, are saying maybe we'll go to Brazil, another major steel-producing nation that is not considering these games. In Kentucky, 175 steel jobs were added from a Spanish company called Acerinox, known as North American Stainless Steel here, the world's second largest stainless steel manufacturer. The then CEO said, I'm moving to America because they're not going to play these silly games. Green job schemes and cap and trade are making me buy ration coupons from the French. I have rolling blackouts. I can't make steel under these conditions. My growth is going elsewhere. Well, now the new CEO is telling people privately who I know, we made a mistake. Don't you love when you convince investors to come here and then they look at our folly and say, gosh, we made a mistake. We're sending all of our growth, it looks like, to Malaysia. What about this import of manufacturing jobs from Europe for doing something climatically meaningless but economically painful? Don't we like? If they want to continue, great. We do not have to follow. Look, a sinking policy ship. Let's jump on. An aluminum facility in Hamburg, Norsk Hydro, closed. Idlinger Gaming, a ceramics facility in Galicia, Spain, just happened to issue a press release while I was there. It's why my favorite example, thanking the state for its ration coupons and announcing that it had equilibrated its business operations, a new term you'll be hearing. That means they went into the business of making nothing. You don't have to hire many people that way or use much of that demonized energy, and they just sell their ration coupons. A pharmaceutical company, begins with a P, out of France, I believe it was Rhodia, said that too is our future. Beats innovation. Use a lot less energy. There were price spikes in windfall profits, reduced energy security, increased likelihood of rolling blackouts. It was so successful, now they're using the word unfair, something in the translation, that they are now threatening a trade war against us if we don't do it to ourselves too. If you don't pay attention to this, you're not paying attention. This is the ultimate red flag. This is such an economic boom that if you don't do it too, we'll start a trade war with you. It's just not fair. Here's from the European Environment Agency's January report. All these blue lines are Europe's economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions. No, they are not plummeting. They only took advantage of what they're now calling early action, but it was post-1990 economic collapse after the Soviet fall. The three gray bars on the right are the covered cap-and-trade rationed emissions. Now, you cap-and-trade, the argument is, well, it gives us certainty of emissions. I know business would like certainty of costs through a tax, but this gives us certainty of emissions, and I don't have to vote for a tax. Do you see certainty of emission reductions there? Even while economy-wide emissions dipped due to mild winters, which ended with a vengeance, and an economic slowdown, which accelerated with a vengeance, economy-wide emissions not molested by this scheme went down on their own. Covered emissions, under a scheme that is so subject to gaming and so distorting, went up. There are that many perverse incentives and disincentives in the scheme. Covered emissions went up even while economy-wide emissions managed to drop due to factors that would have caused these to drop too. This is not about reducing emissions, let alone climate. This is about, you see what it won't do, detectably impact the climate. What would it do then? Let's try to figure out what it's about. Well, it would impose a long-held policy wish list of a usual symphony of grievance groups that have offered it, demanded it, in the name of every threat, greatest and otherwise, for decades. It would impose that. The logical conclusion is that's what it is about. Here's our model, Spain. The president said, in Spain, look what they're doing with green jobs and cap and trade and sending steel jobs to Kentucky. You'll see in 1997, something changed. Emissions began going through the roof. They imposed two very distorting, economically harmful schemes that year. Their green job scheme and cap and trade. The red line is up. Beginning the year, they imposed these schemes. This is the country the president cited as our model, for reasons that have not yet revealed themselves. So, in closing, what does all this tell us? Cap and trade is not about reducing emissions. It won't. Even the Waxman-Markey bill allows emission increases for decades. So it's not about acting now. We must act now. Pass this bill. We must do something. This is something. We must do this. Classic Washington logic. Indeed, cap and trade is demonstrably not about acting. It isn't acting now. It expressly requires or allows emissions to rise and therefore encourages emissions to rise for decades. It's not about emission reductions. It's about imposing a tax and funding much engineering. So they had to let private interests who will give political cover to receive the tax revenue for 12 years. Then the state gets it. And that's really what this is about. No one says cap and trade would do anything under any scenario or set of assumptions about the climate. So that is not what it is about. If you look at the history, the Club of Rome, I have a great slide. In 1991, you may not be familiar with them, they're off of whom the Club for Growth played their name. The Club of Rome was a group of Malthusians, rich, very wealthy people who thought there were just enough of them, way too many of you and me, and if we got wealthy, why? We might have babies, and that would be a terrible thing. Well, in 1991, on their 25th anniversary, they congratulated themselves in a book, and on page 104, they said, we needed a new enemy to rally the public around to push our agenda. And we arrived upon global warming and its parade of horribles as something that would fit the bill. This was in 1991, on page 104, taking credit for having advanced this. As you'll see, it's not about the climate, and it's not even about reducing emissions. So look at the history, the admissions of its origins, and who's now promoting it. At one level, this is about revenue and about good old-fashioned policy favors to certain interests who are providing political cover. At the other, at the ideological level, it is about the one thing that it would accomplish, the long-held policy wish list. So if you want to talk to a different representative who really wants to do this, just ask them, you can ask them first, why do you want to raise my energy taxes? Let them answer it. And then say, what will the temperature be after we pass your tax increase? The same, whatever it will be. It's now projected to be going down for 3 decades, and then, boy, just you wait, warming will set in. Okay. With that, I guess if we have time for Q&A, go to Q&A. If anybody wants to cover sea level rise, hurricanes, Enron, you name it. Oh, don't forget to buy those. And
I told you that Chris would be fabulous.